Welcome to the first day of the rest of your life. My name is Andy Zaremba, and I'm recording a Skype interview today, or I recorded it yesterday actually. I'm doing the intro to the video right now, and I had the privilege of interviewing Paul Selig. And Paul is a channeler and clairaudient, and he's the author of actually 5 channeled texts, 5 books that have been channeled through him. His latest being the Book of Freedom, which we talk quite extensively on the podcast today. And Paul's also going to be coming to Vancouver on February 23rd and 24th for a 2-day workshop. And if you look on the link below on YouTube or above on Facebook, I'm going to have that link. So if you're interested in coming to the workshop with Paul, click that link and you'll be able to get access to it. And Paul is such an interesting phenomenon. And I first got turned on to his work when I was actually in Peru on retreat with Aubrey Marcus. And he was doing a lot of work with his team on it, and they kept on referencing Paul Selig and the Book of Freedom and some of other Paul's books like the Book of Truth and the Book of Mastery and I Am the Word. And the work was really, really intriguing. And you can say what you want about a channeler, but my approach to this interview was, I'm not going to be the skeptic today. It's so easy to say, maybe this is just coming from Paul, or who knows what the source of this is, or what's really going on there. However, I wanted to just look at it from a standpoint of that this is real, this is happening, and one thing I think you could point to as evidence for that is the fact that all these texts are channeled through him directly with zero editing. So these words just flow through him through dictation and then are transcribed and turned into an audiobook. He said in any book that he's ever done, there might be 4 or 5 edits where he might have muffed a word. However, it's all just words that have flown through him without stop. And he literally has hundreds and hundreds of pages, 300 pages in the Book of Freedom that came through audio dictation. And the second one was just listen to the words. Like B is just listen to those words that are coming through his mouth. And I gotta say, when you pay attention and you really take them in, something happens to you. I don't know, physiologically, energetically, psychologically, all different levels that just feels good. And it's difficult to explain that. It's more something that you have to experience. However, I challenge you to just listen to the words that Paul says when you're listening to an audiobook or reading his books or listening to this podcast, and just listen to the truths that come through his mouth, because I think there's a ton of wisdom. One of the ones that comes through quite frequently is the lesson of, you cannot be in the light and hold another in darkness, right? Because we're so used to being in this condemning mindset of the other and everyone else is wrong other than me. And Paul talks about when you do that, and actually coming from the guides, when you do that, you're really also condemning yourself. And I think that's something that we kind of forget. And it's so easy to point the finger when we're doing that, we should be pointing the finger inwardly. And this is just one of the small lessons that Paul talks about quite frequently and comes through the guides. And he also did a reading on me personally, which was really, really interesting. And I haven't decided if I'm going to tack it on the end or not. You'll find out if you listen all the way through. But I have to say, it touched on some areas of my life that I'm really working on personally. And when he said it at first, I was like, okay, yeah, those make sense. And I listened to it 3 or 4 more times since then. And he really just touched on things that I'm working with personally in my own life and trying to move through. And it's really fascinating. So what I would recommend is come into this podcast with an open mind and try coming out to the workshop. If you want to see Paul in person, that's going to be February 23rd, 24th. And of course, there'll be linked in the video below on YouTube or or on iTunes and Stitcher, whatever you're listening to. And just come out with an open mind and learn more. And of course, as usual, this podcast is sponsored by Floathouse. This is our business where I'm recording this out of right now. And we got some big changes coming and happening around Floathouse. We're going to be installing 4 float cabins. We have 3 installed right now. And these things are just awesome. And I think it's going to be really useful for 2 groups of people who might have struggled getting in our tanks before. people who have mobility issues are going to have much more easy access to the floating environment through these cabins because they have a huge door. You basically swing the door open, you can step right in. I can physically stand up, like I'm 6'1", I can physically stand up inside the tank and my head does not touch the top of the ceiling. So that's really great for people with mobility issues because the pain relief aspect of floating is so beneficial for so many people. And when you're in a lot of pain, let's be honest, sometimes it's hard to climb in and out of that tank. So these cabins are going to make it much easier for people with accessibility issues. And secondly, people with claustrophobia. And the interesting thing about the claustrophobic people is that a lot of them are the ones who experience anxiety and even depression or a mix of the two. And the funny thing is, if you want to look into this research, check out Justin Feinstein 2017-2018 either or video from the Float conference. And he's doing contemporary research on flotation tanks now on specifically the treatment of anxiety disorders. And the interesting thing about it is the population of people that it can help the most, which, by the way, is a huge population. He estimates at any given time there's 40 million people in the U.S. suffering from anxiety disorders of some type. The ones who floating could benefit the most, potentially, are the ones who are most afraid to get in it. And we've been doing this naturally over the years at Floathouse of this process of exposure. And it's gradually introducing somebody to the float environment and in a way that's not going to, that will help actually condition them to learn that they can handle the float environment. So what we'll typically do is we'll show somebody the tank and they'll see, oh, that's really big. And now it'll be the cabin. And the cabins are even bigger and more voluminous. And people look at it and they're like, oh, that's not nearly as bad as I thought it was. Then we're like, okay, cool. And then they actually get in the tank, and maybe for the first 5-10 minutes they float with the door open. And they get used to that sensation of floating. Then maybe they get a little bit braver. And then they'll go and put the pool noodle in the door, shut the door, and a little crack of light coming through, and they'll just float with that. Okay? And after a while, you'll be like, oh, I'm fine. I trust the environment. I'm in complete control. I can get out whenever I want. I can end the experience whenever I want. And then they'll finally get in there and shut the door. And even sometimes when that happens, we have music playing. And again, that music is a nice transitory phase from going from, full sensory stimuli in the outside world to maximum sensory reduction in the flotation tank. And then eventually you turn off that music, and now you're just in complete sensory not deprivation, sensory reduced environment. In fact, that word is actually not even relevant, as in fact, it actually becomes a form of sensory enhancement. And there's this great term that we've kind of come across lately, thanks to Justin Feinstein, the float researcher, of this idea of interoception. So what it is when you have all the sensory input being removed as much as possible, and different areas of your brain start to not receive that information, it starts receiving information internally. So it really ramps up everything that you're experiencing internally, from every little body sensation that you might be feeling to what's going on emotionally, what's going on with your thoughts. And that is really where the gold lies with flotation therapy. And if you can get somebody who has an anxiety disorder to go in there and feel the sensations that come up when they're experiencing anxiety, typically it's going to be heart rate, it's going to be breathing, and also muscle tension, which is a huge one. And floating acts on all of those. So it calms them all down. And you can't be in a state of fight or flight or stress response and relaxation at the same time. So when you start feeling those internal processes, you can actually start to disassociate that with a fear response and turn that into a relaxation response. So when you start experiencing those symptoms outside of the tank, you've essentially weakened the connection between the physical sensation of anxiety and actually relating it to the relaxation response. And it can actually definitely, across 50 subjects that entered in the first round of research, all of them experience a reduction in state anxiety. And now Feinstein has actually received a grant from the NIH, to the National Institute of Health, to continue his research because they found that actually one session of flotation therapy is actually more effective than anti-anxiety medications like a benzodiazepine is the example that he used. In fact, he said a benzo will last about 4 to 6 hours in terms of the anxiety reduction, where a float will actually last, and they tested this clinically, 20 hours post-float. So you're getting more benefit of relaxation without taking any medication. And that's something that the NIH is really interested in, because, of course, they're looking for a cure or a solution to this anxiety-ridden population that we happen to live in right now. So that was a long talk about floating, but it's something that I want to get out. Of course, I really want to get to this interview with Paul Selig, because it was a great conversation. One last note about Paul is I felt that he was a genuinely heartfelt and caring human being. Like, I really felt that he cared about me as an interviewer. He cares about people in general, and he's just a very kind-hearted man at the very least. And he just, spouts out wisdom pretty much with every word that he says. So without further ado, I give you Paul Selig. Welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real. My name is Andy Zaremba, and with me on a call today we have Paul Selig. First of all, Paul, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview today, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been in Vancouver before. I know we were talking back and forth with Sarah. She had mentioned you had come to Vancouver before, but it's been a while. And how long has it been since you've been here?
I think it's been about a year and a half or so since I've been in Vancouver.
Oh, okay. Did you do a workshop when you were here last time?
I did, yeah.
Okay, excellent. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how this connection came to be for myself. In fact, in July, I was in Peru with Aubrey Marcus and his crew from On It. And while we were there, he kept on referring to your work in the Book of Freedom and to this gentleman named Paul Selig. And it was very intriguing. In fact, he actually did a ceremony with one of his members from his On It Academy where he recited some of the attunements from your book. And it intrigued me. And from there, I started diving into your work. I downloaded the Book of Truth, and I listened to that one, and and then I listened to the Book of Mastery. I'm not exactly sure why it came in that order, but that's what it did. And then I was sent the Book of Freedom, and this is the new book that you've just released. And one of the things I find most interesting about these texts is that they're completely channeled. From your words, you say that these flow through you, through the guides, through you, and there's basically no adjustments made to the words that come through, which I find lends itself to quite a bit of credibility around this work, because if I tried to sit there and I tried to flow out 300 plus words of any kind of book, I don't think I would be capable of doing that. And I think it's very interesting that they can just flow out with minimal corrections. And I think that sort of lends itself to the credibility of the work. And the other thing about listening to the audio and also reading the book, it does start working on you in strange ways right away. And sometimes it's a bit of a feeling. Sometimes I feel like maybe I'm paying attention to them more, and there's more lessons coming through that show up in interesting ways. Like you say so often, it's not necessarily going to come through in a way that you like. And I've had some sort of almost rude awakenings. One time a few weeks ago, I wasn't being very present while taking a shower, and I was really in my head, and I was doing this mental complaining thing that I do sometimes, and I literally slipped in the shower and fell. I grabbed onto the shower curtain, fell over, and I managed just to hang on, and I was like, wow, I'm really not paying attention right now.
Yeah.
And I started noticing things like this happen more and more, these things that were just basically forcing me to pay attention to the present moment and get me out of my head. Is this something that you see happen when people start to dive into this work?
Well, I don't see the effects of the work on people. I hear reports like yours, but the books are channeled, so the books are in the world. And then I do workshops all over the place where I'm with the guides and in the energy with other people. But I don't necessarily see what happens to them when they go home and they get in the shower. I know
Right.
that for myself, when I'm up in my head, I'm apt to trip, and I'm up in my head a lot, so I get knocked back into my reality of the moment quite frequently. But people, report changes in many ways working with the text. The guides say, are energetic transmissions that are working with the reader. So there's a whole conversation happening between you and the energy of the book as you're working with it and then incorporating it into your life.
Right. And it's definitely been, I'd say, an integration process, and one that I'm still continually working on.
Mhm.
One of the big ones I found for myself is stepping out of judgment, and that's been a very tough one, but one that I can say that I feel like I'm making progress in, and it's this area of judgment I think that gets us in so much trouble as human beings, and it's difficult too, right? I mean, I feel like we do need a certain amount of discernment in our lives to keep ourselves safe and make our way through the world. But at the same time, it's the judgment of others, which, well, basically you would say you're manifesting the small self, when you start doing that and when you're looking at the judgments of others. Is that correct in thinking that?
Well, and the guides I work with have said many times, what you judge, you fear. And then the action of fear is to claim more fear. And I agree that there's a difference between, discernment and judgment. And I think it's fine. I live in Manhattan. It's not a bad idea to have a lock on my door, and I do.
Yes.
But it would probably be something other than to decide who I'm going to let into my world based on some idea of who somebody's supposed to be. So what I think we do is we use judgment. We call from the collective ideas of what is supposed to be and what is good and what is not. We end up reinforcing the very paradigms of separation, that we say we don't want.
Right. Now, this is something again I've been working with quite a bit. But for people who are completely new to your work, I wanted to strip it right down to the basics. And can you explain to people? You claim to be a channeler and a clairvoyant. Can we
Mhm.
start off by getting an explanation on exactly what a channeler is and what a clairvoyant is?
Sure. Well, I'm primarily a clairaudient, and clairaudient means clear hearing. And I work with guides that I hear. It's not like there's a voice in the room. Channeling for me is taking dictation. And what it really is like when I'm working is I'll sit down, I do a little meditation where I recede or step away. I imagine myself climbing into the backseat of a car and turning the wheel over to my guides. Then I'll hear a voice, or I'll get a thought, you can call it that, that's in a distinct voice that's not quite my own. And I'll hear it repeated a number of times. And once I speak it and give it voice, all of the other words pile out on top of it. And all I'm doing is keeping up with the dictation. I hear phrase, 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 and I'm odd, and then I whisper the words and repeat them. So channeling for me is dictation. I'm a radio, if you want to think of it that way. And when I work as a radio, as a channel, I'm tuned into my guides and they're the broadcast. When I work psychically, and that's where the other things sort of come into play. Say if I were reading you, you would be the radio station that I would tune into.
Right.
And so when I start to hear you or become you, now the ways that I access information are through the other abilities. Clairvoyance is clear sight, and clairsentience is clear feeling. I work very often as a clairsentient. So if I were to step into you, first thing I would get is what it feels like to be in your body, be in your emotional life, and I may take a posture for it, and then I'll often start to hear. And I'll often start to hear an aspect of you explaining the posture to me or what's really going on that you need addressed. And then my guides may come in and give commentary on it. Clairvoyance is clear sight, so that's visual information. So I'll often see things. When I first started to open up, the first thing that really did open up was clairvoyance, was seeing these little things like fireflies start to go off around people. But, for me, the clairvoyance is a backup ability. It's not what I rely on first and foremost. When I get visual information, that's clairvoyance.
Okay, so you mostly rely on the auditory processing.
Mm-hmm.
So when these thoughts are coming in, do they
Mm-hmm.
come in spontaneously, or do somebody have to ask you a question, or one day will you be sitting there and these thoughts start streaming in and you just start reciting them?
I have free will, and I don't. That doesn't get overridden. So sometimes I've been known to say, if I want to walk into oncoming traffic, I can do that.
Yeah.
But if I say to my guides, "Is this a good time to cross the street?" they may say, "Not wise." And
Yes.
not wise means, I still have the choice to do it, but it's not the highest choice I can make. I generally have to ask a question, and then I'll get an answer. It's easiest for me to do this in service to other people. So, just because I can hear, people sometimes think I've got a pipeline to, getting my own answers met. But I tend to have an investment in the answers about my own life, so I'm not the best person to be reading. Whereas when I read for you or when I'm channeling, I can be much more neutral. I don't have a real stake in the outcome.
Right. Now, this ability came to you in a fairly interesting way. At the beginning of the Book of Truth, it explains how you had an experience which led you to looking up actually one of the versions of the Bible, if I'm not mistaken about that. And that led you to becoming a channeler or realizing that you had this ability. Can you take us back to the very beginning, to that incident that maybe prompted you to look for that book and then unlocked your abilities?
Well, it's a longer story than that. I was sort of a rock and roll playwright. I'd gone to Yale, out to the drama school. I was getting some success very, very young. And I had a list of things that I thought I had to have achieved in the world that I thought would make me okay. And I got the whole list, and I wasn't okay. And I was kind of bottoming out in a hotel room in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I was working on an opera. And the Gideons leave these books in the drawer. And for some reason that night, I decided to take it out, and it said prayer for people in crisis. And for whatever reason, I'd been raised an atheist, so I wasn't into this stuff at all. But I said the prayer, and I think I meant it. And I don't know that I could have named the crisis I was in, but I was in one. And 3 days later, I heard a voice telling me to get my act together, and I listened to it, and that was the beginning. What you may be referencing is something that happened a number of years later. A few things happened. I actually, shortly thereafter that, when I was, I think, still 25 or so, I went up to the roof of this building that I lived in.
Yes, that's what I was referring to.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was this thing happening in '87 called the harmonic convergence. And I heard people were going to be waking up. And I thought, well, if there is a God or something like a God, and I was just starting to think maybe there was, I thought, well, why wouldn't it want you to wake up? That made no sense. So I just went up to the roof of this place that I lived in, and I had a crystal and a mantra, and I thought you needed the props to wake up,
Yeah.
But I just asked, and I think I asked from a truthful place. But I had an experience of energy that was sort of moving from the base of my body up, and out through the top of my head. And that was when I started seeing little lights around people after that. People later said it sounded like a spontaneous Kundalini awakening. And I don't know what it was. I could have been hyperventilating. I always say that. But for me, it was a marker because it was, for me, evidential. There was something happening that I couldn't deny. And when I work with the guides, most people feel the energy that comes through in a way that's that palpable.
Right. And then there was a point in one of the books, I can't remember exactly which one, where you described you were working in a palliative care unit and you were attending to people. Is that correct, a palliative care unit?
Nope. I was volunteering. I had just started a form of healing. Okay. And I was volunteering in a center that had opened up in Lower Manhattan that was providing services for people with life-challenging illness.
Okay, life-challenging illness, right.
Yeah, it was the height of the AIDS epidemic, and there were no cures, and there were these alternative places that were opening up, and I had just studied healing, and I got a phone call asking me if I would come and help, and I said yes. So that was where I began to open up as a clairaudient and actually as a physical empath, because I didn't know I could do these things until I was doing them. I'm not trained in channeling or these other abilities. That started a form of energy healing. But yeah, I found that if I had my hands on people's bodies, I started to get information for them in language I would hear. If I had my hands on your chest and I heard the name Chester or Philip, I learned to say, "Who's Chester?" And he'd say, "Well, that's my father or my brother or my cousin who beat me up when I,
Right.
whatever." And it'd all be this, all the energy would move, and I kept getting proven out. And I started to feel what was going on in other people's bodies, which is clairsentience, which was, again, the beginning of this opening that's continued on, many years later.
Okay. Right. So that's sort of how you got to this role of being a channeler and a clairaudient. Now, I want to jump ahead a little bit and just ask you very directly, you know, what are the guides?
Mm. They're teachers. I mean, that's how I understand them. They say that they're teachers. They're only called the guides because when my ex found out that I could do this, used to say, "Ask the guides this, ask the guides that." So I
Right.
was, the psychic in residence. But I found out that I could read in those days, and I hadn't been trying to do readings at all. I was just only accessing information in this little group that I held in my apartment every week. I was a college teacher. I taught at NYU for 25 years. I wasn't doing this visibly until the book started coming only about 10 years ago. So, remind me of the question, please.
So the question is, well, what are the guides? And a
The
few other,
guide.
another maybe some follow-up questions to that would be, well, how long have they been here? Where are they from? Why are they working with us as human beings?
I mean, I'll tell you the little bit that I know about it. The
Sure.
name that they've given when they've announced a name, and that wasn't until the Book of Mastery, they said, if you want to call us something, you can call us Melchizedek, which is a name and it's a priesthood and it's a lineage of priests. And, there are some people that believe that Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, or that Melchizedek was Jesus and came through in that incarnation. I don't know the esoteric lineage of this stuff because that's sort of not my stuff.
Right.
I spend my time going there. And in fact, I often feel like the less I know, the better off I am, because it keeps me a clear channel. So that's the name. And the being that I've seen when I've had a few visual encounters with the guides has been in some ways a depiction of that energy. It's quite a wonderful presence to see. They say that, they've been here a long time, that the basis of their teaching is also the basis of, most of the world's religions, but that those religions have in some ways become distorted over time and heavily politicized or moved by, economic need as opposed to the initial truth.
Sure.
So I don't get that this is a new teaching. I really don't. I do think that perhaps what's unique about the teaching is it's coming through with an energy and through attunements that support the people that work with it and having an actual experience that goes well beyond the intellect.
Yes.
And that's exciting, to me.
And why have they chosen to work with human beings? Like, why would they come down, and what's their intention for this process? Like, why not let us sort it out on our own?
Well, we can, but they said in the very first book that humanity is at a time of reckoning, and a reckoning is a facing of oneself and all of one's creations. And they said, in our fear and in our desire to be safe, we've just built bigger bombs,
Yes.
which is the most insane thing they said they've ever heard. To build a larger bomb to remain safe. And bombs will eventually go off. In most cases, that's what they're made for. So, I mean, we really have great opportunity now for growth. That's what I do here. And they're here to shepherd us into this. But we still have free will. I mean, the guides say, you learn, we're in a body. We have opportunities to learn through everything. Nothing is wasted. It's all an opportunity to learn. If we want to learn through blowing ourselves to kingdom come, we can do that, but we don't have to. There are other ways to learn. And they're really here to facilitate us in sort of reclaiming who they say we've always been or truly are.
So they're here as teachers and to guide us, and it's interesting how the work finds people, I guess, because it does seem to resonate with some people and not with others for whatever reason. But why do you think they have chosen you as a channel? Because I think you are the first person I've ever spoken to in my life that actually has an ability like this. So why have they chosen you?
I mean, I've asked this in different ways, and they've spoken to it in different ways. And they basically, in the books, they say, well, I signed on for it.
Okay.
And this is work that I've been doing with them in other lifetimes, and this is an ongoing conversation. I can speak from myself and my own sense of intent here. I had a couple of experiences in my late 20s, early 30s, which were fairly profound, which made me have an awareness that there was more, irrefutably more. And given who I was and who I had been, that challenged everything that I believed to be true. It turned my world upside down or inside out. It wasn't at all comfortable. I wasn't looking to become spiritual. I'm not a good spiritual guy, and I'm certainly not a spiritual teacher or guru. I'm a channeler. I just show up and take dictation. But there was a point when I actually was studying with this healing teacher. This is in my early 30s. And she said, ask for one thing, write it down, and you're going to get it. And she sort of gave us a prayer to ask. And I wrote it down. And in retrospect, what I asked for was what the guides brought. I didn't ask to be a channel. I didn't even necessarily believe in channeling all that much. But I did ask, I think, yes, I hear yes, to go all the way with whatever this thing was. If I was like, if this thing is real, it changes everything I thought. And, for somebody that's been given as much evidence as I have over the years, I still question things. I can still be skeptical. I can still question the teachings, and I often do in the books that come through me. I often interrupt and say, what do you mean? And what is this? So I think I asked for it in this lifetime as well, not as it's evolved or been depicted, but I feel that, it's also a strangely good use of my gifts, and I'll say that, and I didn't even know why. In retrospect, it makes perfect sense that this is what I'm doing, but if you asked me 15 years ago, I'd say not in your life,
Right.
Yeah.
How has this work affected you personally? Because you say many times that you're also a student of the guides. So how have you changed from the person you were before you started doing it and to who you are now?
Well, it's ongoing, and I don't feel some days terribly evolved or even like a terribly good student, and I really don't feel that I'm the poster boy for the teachings that come through me, and maybe I am. Maybe it is about just sort of being able to sit in a chair and say, I don't know some days, because I often don't. I will say that my entire life is different. I taught at NYU for 25 years. I was an academic. I had an idea of who I should be in the world and how I should be seen and what it was supposed to look like in different ways. And mostly I've had to let go of all of that. I'm living a very, very different life. And it took me, because I only left my academic life about 3 years ago, it took me this long to sort of say, wow, this is kind of great.
Yes.
But I was very attached to who I was. And I'm a shy man in many ways, and I've been a frightened man in many ways of my life. And sort of continuing to throw myself out there in this way has challenged me and continues to.
Yes.
But, it seems to come with the territory, and so far, at least, the world hasn't ended because I show up and channel. No. And I'm happy about that.
I can imagine there must have been some fear around leaving a very stable profession, moving as a channeler, and throwing yourself into the arena that way.
Well, I didn't think of it as an arena. I thought about it a bit more as throwing myself to the lions. I mean, the first time I ever did a podcast, it was a cable thing, some interview, right after the first book. Nobody knew who I was, and nobody had seen me really work. And, I introduced myself and my story in this interview with this guy. And then I channeled. And, I know what I look like when I channel, which is pretty great.
Yeah.
Whisper, I repeat.
Mm-hmm.
I was very heavy. I was rocking back and forth like I was at the Wailing Wall. I mean, it wasn't a graceful interview, but it's what I did. And I went, okay, I can live with this. At least I got to introduce myself and people can hear the man before the guides come through. And then the interview got broken up into like 3-minute YouTube clips, and it was all over the place.
Oh, no.
These headlines like Paul Selig channels on ET realities. And, people, I mean, I don't read the comments anymore. I've learned not to. Mm-hmm. But then I did, and it was like, it couldn't have been worse. And I could feel it because I'm clairsentient, so I could feel the attack.
Yeah.
And I went to bed, and I said to the guides, if you want me to do this work, why are you letting this happen to me?
Hmm.
And their response was, well, as long as you care what people think about you, this is going to be an issue.
Hmm.
So back on me.
So that's that invitation to fear, and then creating that positive feedback loop in itself, and you're fueling that fear, fueling that criticism. The more you read into it, perhaps.
Well, in retrospect, I had my ear, with a glass up to the wall. I really wanted to know what people thought, and I think I was seeking approval
Right.
for what I do. And I can't do that anymore. I can show up, and some people are going to get it, and some people aren't, and it doesn't need to be for everybody, as you said. I've heard stories about people finding these books, and I mean, because I ask in workshops, how did you find, what brought you here? How did you find this? And I must have heard at least a dozen times I went into a bookstore and the book fell off the shelf and hit me. I mean, it's that direct.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
But finding this stuff, and that seems to be how it's meant to work.
It's interesting because that's sort of been my experience as well with diving into this work myself. Um, One of the big overarching themes within all of your books, it seems like, is it's an idea around transformation or personal transformation from the small self to what you refer to as the high self, the divine, the Christ, or the true self. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems like that's what we're on the journey of moving towards, according to the teachings from the guides. For people who have never heard of this before, can you define exactly what the small self is, and then move to what the high self is?
I'll try. So they talk about the personality as a structure, which they call the small self. And, the personality structure, they say, is basically dependent on many things. It's like when you were born, what generation you are, and, what religion you're brought up in or lack of, then what ethnicity you are, and what your parents said you were, and what your teachers told you to be, and what society would demand of you at any given time. So,
Hmm.
in some ways, we're a compilation of all these things. And it's not that those things are wrong, but they're not who we are. I mean, I can say I'm Paul. I live in New York City. I'm in my 50s. I'm in a male body. This is what I do for work now. But that's not who I am. Those are ways of knowing myself or being known by others. It's part of the interaction. So the small self, they say, is actually based in historical data. And what the small self wants to do is basically replicate that data. So if my father or my mother said, you're a failure, and I walk around with what they guys call a frame is a construct of personality, the purpose of that frame is to affirm what I was taught to be and then to call the evidence into it. So if I'm God's gift to whatever, and I hold that up, that's my expectation as well. So that's the personality self. The true self, the guides say, well, they use a lot of different words. They say true self, divine self, eternal self, Christed self. And their definition of Christ is interesting. And they say that Christ is the aspect of the Creator that seeks to be in realization as and through you, as who you are and what you are. And I think in different esoteric teachings, there are probably different names for it. The one I hear sometimes from the guides is monad as a term, but for
Nomad?
the most, monad with an M,
Monad. Gotcha.
which I think means like the one of all, but I don't recall the definition. Um, the idea of the Christ, or the Word, which is another word that they use, seeking realization in form, is part of the teaching of all of their work. And they say that the true self is realized, which means known, as who and what we are in identity form, which is inclusive of the body, and energetic field, which is our consciousness in vibration, for lack of a better descriptor. And what they seem to be doing is bringing us through a sequence of teachings and attunements to a realization or a knowing of who and what we are for the purpose of the lifting of all things. They say this stuff works in co-resonance. So the claim, I know how I serve, which is one of their claims, is a claim of the divine expressing as you for the benefit of all.
Right. So, when somebody is, say, moving closer towards Or let's even go further. If somebody has come close to that full realization, that divine self, the Christ self, how is that going to manifest? Will it be similar for people, or will it manifest in different ways for every individual?
That's a really interesting question. I probably have to go to them with
Okay.
this. And, if I start channeling in this interview, there we go. I mean, then all bets I
Well,
had a long day. Well, it's been known to happen. It manifests as it needs to through each person, when at the level of attainment that they can hold. True self as you, the true self as you is always present as the truth of who you are, how you realize truth, or come into agreement to it. Is a process of acclamation, is a process of acclamation to a higher octave, of vibration, to align to it, calls your life to a higher accord, calls your life to a higher accord. And what you call to you and what you call to you must be of equal vibration, The one who knows herself in shame, the one who knows herself in shame will be liberated from shame, The one who demands to rule others, the one who demands to rule others will know himself in service to others, will know himself in service to others. You cannot be the light. You cannot be the light, and hold another in darkness. To be realized through this work, is to know who you are, is to know who you are, everybody else as well, and who everybody else is as well, beyond the structure of study, beyond the structure of personality which you've been entrenched in, period. And you're saying period.
right. And this is talking about, a transition again from the small self to the high self. And one of the things that's very frequent within all the books, a lot of the channeling that happens when the guides come through, are these attunements.
Yeah.
And from how they've described it, or how I understand them, is that they're tuning you to match a certain vibration that will align you to that true self, to the high self. And I was just a question, like, is this something that you have to do on a regular basis? Like, if you hear an attunement, are you going to start tuning into that automatically, or do you have to continually do the work and make sure you keep tuning in order to transform yourself that way?
I mean, I'll try to explain it my way, and then they may come in and interrupt and correct me. But if you go back to the metaphor of the radio, so imagine what the attunements do is they tune up the radio that you are, that I am, that anybody is, to be able to play the broadcast that already exists in a higher octave. So the station's always playing, but we haven't been aligned to it. So the attunements, which are done through language, are there to support you in this claim, and they're often felt or experienced physically in the vibrational field.
Yeah.
So what I understand is until you're able to hold the station, to maintain that vibration, you'll be going back and forth a bit. With the teachings that they're continuing to bring through, and it's funny, Aubrey Marcus has written the introduction to the newest book that's coming out in August, is very much about holding the vibration at the higher level, and what the guides call the upper room, which is an octave of expression. So one of the things that they've said is that the attunements, and the one that they work with the most, I know who I am in truth, I know what I am in truth, I know how I serve in truth, I am free, I am free, I am free, are as notes played on a piano. And when those notes are played at once, in resonance, it strikes a chord. And the chord is the vibrational field in its sort of demonstration of this. And then there's a whole other attunement, which is the claim, I have come, I have come, I have come, which is the true self in manifestation. So at that point, all of the other attunements have been absorbed into the expression. There's no need to claim it. The example the guides have used is, if you're in a male body, in most cases, you're in a male body. And you don't have to go around and saying, hi, this is who I am, and I'm in a male body. It's just something or hi, I have blue eyes.
Yeah.
It's apparent. You wouldn't denounce it. So, but we become so over-identified with a personality self that the idea of knowing the self as the true self is radical to us. And so the holding of the higher alignment for most people is a process. That's how I understand it.
Right. Now, if it's a process and once it gets moving,
Hmm?
is there any turning back? Because we talked about this idea about free will and that they can't interfere with free will. However, if you're on this process and we're all in this sort of course to align to the high self and eventually, hopefully, all align to the high self, how does free will interplay with that idea of transformation? Like, do you have to give it permission to happen, or
Yeah.
will it happen regardless?
My understanding with this work is that permission is needed.
Okay.
You need to be able to say, okay, I'm willing. You know, I mean, that's kind of a baseline here because they don't override free will. Now, at a certain level, my understanding with this stuff is that everything's under the jurisdiction of the soul anyway. And if the soul wants you to grow, be prepared because
Right.
it's going to happen. But I do feel, and I think that this is true, if I want to sit in my crap all day, I can do it. Nobody's going to make me get off the couch,
Yeah.
or stop being miserable. I can choose that if I want to, but I don't have to. And I think when you do this work, it actually becomes much, much more challenging to stay stuck in your stuff, because
Right.
everything is trying to move you forward.
Right. And along those lines, does it require faith that it will happen? Or if you just automatically tune in, will it start happening regardless? Like, do you have to believe in it, or will it just happen if you actually start saying the words?
I hear it will happen if you say the word, right? But I hear in a different way than if you align in consciousness to it. Exactly right. So here's the example. If I put on say, in an old jukebox, if you play, D4, whatever, the song that you expect to come on is going to come on.
Yeah.
But you can also sort of leave the room or, choose to plug your ears up. So if you work with the attunements, the language of the attunements itself, which you can call invocation or incantation, as you can call whatever you want, seems to work with the energy field. So it's why, I've done groups with a couple hundred people, and people who've never felt energy say the words and they can feel the current run through them.
Right.
And that's a big deal for them. But does that mean they're going to sustain this? No. Then there are choices you have to make to work with it and to align to it.
Right.
So, but you see, the thing is, you've been attuned, so you can always do it. The radio that you are can always play the higher broadcast, but you may have to choose it.
Yes. So it does take work, and it's an ongoing process from what I'm hearing. The next question I have is a question I found a little bit problematic in the teachings, and this is one of the ones that I struggle with because it was around the idea of value and meaning. And if I go to page, let's see here, 239 in the book, I've made some notes. Let's see here. It talks about how eventually everything is going to. Sorry, this is 256. I have to go to. So 256. The leveling of reality to an equal plane will finally come one way or the next. And to me, that kind of says that this is going to happen regardless, one way or the other. So we can either all work towards this and try to raise ourselves up to the true self, to the divine self, or it's going to happen regardless anyways, and we're going to have this sort of flattening that will occur. Can you go into that a little more detail?
I don't recall the passage, so I don't know what they were referencing. I mean, honestly,
Right.
I'm just taking the dictation.
Yes.
Sometimes the first time I really hear it is when I'm in the recording studio doing the audiobook.
Yes.
So the leveling of what? The leveling of society? The leveling of consciousness?
It says the leveling of reality to an equal plane finally will come in one way or the next. And your pretense, one higher than the next, will be met through your own actions, but they do not have to be.
All right. So I mean, if I'm right about what they're speaking to, it's this idea of separation that we've been so stuck in. And it plays out in all kinds of different ways, which is, who's better than the one beside him and what it means to be worthy and who's allowed in and who's allowed out.
Right.
I mean, in the States right now, it's playing out like crazy with
Yes.
this, and it's practically all over the world. But to the guides, this whole idea that one human being can be more worthy than another is incredible. It's incredible. It's impossible.
Right.
My little dog has a toy, and she's doing it in the background, so I may have to get her. She's entertaining
Okay.
herself.
That's
She's
okay.
being
If
ignored.
you need to go get her, go get her.
Lily, come on. Come on over here. We'll see. I may get up. She may have gotten the message.
Okay.
It's like the one squeaky thing she owns.
And of course she goes for it
So
right
this
now.
idea that one is, one human being and one human life is worth more than the next, but it goes into this whole idea, which is what Book of Freedom really begins to address, are the collective belief systems that we've prescribed all of this meaning to, that are really there to, frankly, keep us in a sense of control. And I'm going to get her toy.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Come in, Paul. I'm back.
Oh, great. We got another.
A special guest star for a minute.
What's their name?
This is Lily.
Lily. All right.
She's a big girl now. She was tiny a few months ago, but she likes to watch TV.
Well,
so
thanks for joining us, Lily.
So that's what they're speaking to, and I think this whole thing is something that we've been perpetuating, and we can't anymore. It really is that simple. It's a perpetuated belief system that I think is potentially going to be the end of us if we don't change. At least that's what I hear.
So not valuing one over the other, and this again, when I start thinking about this, it starts getting into the talk around, let's say, what's good and evil, right? Mm-hmm. And there are people who have arguably created evil acts against humanity, and how do we reconcile that? Because the guys are saying that everyone is equal and everything happens, in the service of, say, source, the service of God or the divine, whatever you want to call it. Yet these acts of evil come, and how do we move past the judgment of those people who do those things, how do we move past that?
Well, I mean, the guides don't talk about evil. That's not really been one of their teachings. They do say that we exist in a shared octave with highs and lows. Do you know what I mean? Like any octave of music, and that there are others above that.
Yep.
So they also say some very basic things, like you can't be the light and hold another in darkness. And what you damn damns you back. And what you put in the darkness calls you to it. So how we attend to these things is very much, I suspect, dependent on what we want to get back from it. Now, if I want to have my moral indignation and call somebody evil or damn them, I can do that. Yeah. But in doing that, I'm calling myself to that level of vibration. There's an exercise in the Book of Mastery, and it's a very interesting one, where they say, you have everybody sort of walking up a mountain.
Is that the one where you go into the cave?
Go into the cave, yeah.
Right.
And in that cave is the one person you never want to see again as long as you live.
Mm-hmm.
And your job is then to escort that person out of the cave. And the guides say, because you put them in there.
Right.
And they've called you into the darkness. So it's not about forgiving them or saying what you did was okay, and I support the act that you did. It is the realization, finally, I suspect, that the divine must exist in all things or nothing at all.
Right.
You really can't have it both ways, and that's a kind of a mind blower,
Yes.
And I understand it, and I get it. But what they've said is, if you, in their later work, in the next book, they talk about lifting things and people to what they call the upper room, which is a higher level of vibration. And they say as long as you're calling the man evil, you can't lift him. You can't realize the divine as him.
Yeah.
And it's the realization of the divine as him that supports this. Okay?
Yes. You got a hold of the squeaky toy again?
She got another one.
Okay, so again, we want to get away from this idea of judgment. And another big function that the Book of Freedom covers is the idea of overcoming fear or, say, maybe negative emotions like anger and jealousy. And when it comes to something like fear, fear can sometimes have utility. And for me, it's one of those things that it's a pointer. Like it's telling me what to pay attention to within my life. And it's not necessarily um, a bad thing because it is actually guiding me, like, well, potentially away from danger or maybe towards something that's calling me forward, something that I have to overcome within my own life. So in that regard, because it seems like fear gets cast in, say, a lower vibration, to say it more succinctly with how the guides might say it. Um, but it seems like it has quite a bit of utility within like the world of duality that we live in. So how do we reconcile that idea that we should get out of fear, but sometimes fear is very useful to us on this plane?
Well, they don't talk about this as a world of duality, so that's immediately where it gets a little. The whole paradigm starts to get clumsy.
Right.
I mean, they're actually speaking about non-duality, I expect,
Yeah.
and realization of the divine in all things. So what the guides have said about fear, because it was asked, and it was a really good question when it was asked, which is, if God is all things, then what about fear? And the
Right.
guides said fear is of God too, but it just doesn't know it.
Mm.
It's just denying its own nature. So that's one thing. Now, what they say again and again is that the action of fear is to claim more fear. And they say, look at the last choice you made because you were afraid and see what it got you. And more than likely, you'll find that it's more fear. And they'll also say, there's not a lie that's ever been told that hasn't been told in fear.
Right.
And if you look at the last lie, you'll find that that's probably the case, even if it's, I didn't want to hurt his or her feelings. I would love to go out with you tonight, but I have plans. I'm so sorry, which really means not on your life. So there's that stuff. Now, the utility of fear is interesting. And what I expect is that there are different ways to learn. So I can learn, how not to. I can learn not to touch a hot frying pan by burning my hand. That's one way to learn. I'm scared to burn my hand again, but I'm really not scared. I just don't want to burn my hand. So the example I hear sometimes is, if you're out camping and there's a bear that comes to the campsite, leave, run, go. That's self-preservation. But and there's adrenaline and all those things, but you're not frightened of bears. And you're not vilifying bears. If I had 10 locks on my door in New York, I think there'd be a problem, but I have one, and that suffices.
Right.
So I'll leave it at that. I'm asking if they want to say anything. I'm getting no. So
No. Okay. And I guess the bigger question is then, when we do start experiencing fear, how do we overcome that?
Well, you have to understand, I suspect, that you're agreeing to fear. You're agreeing to it. And, that's then choice. So they're saying, what do you want for yourself? You can be free. You can be in fear if you wish. They're saying you may learn there sometimes. It's not the highest choice, but many choose this. Learn higher way means to learn in a higher way means you take authority. You take authority. You make a new choice. You make a new choice beyond the old programming, that you should be afraid, that you should be afraid. The belief that you should be afraid and protected by fear and are protected by your fears is something that you must understand. If you use fear, if you are taught to use fear for safety, you will continue to build bombs and operate in separation
Right. Okay. Now, also, a lot of these teachings talks about, we have a known universe. We have a known reality that we all can agree to. And, there is something that exists outside of the known reality, maybe unordinary reality, if you want to call it that. And that might be something that we're unaware of. And we are moving towards this sort of homogeneity towards this greater understanding, this greater being. But if we don't know what's possible, the whole part of it is how can we go into the unknown if we only know what we know?
Well, that's because the small self knows itself through history. And the guides say again and again, nothing can be claimed until it's first a possibility. So the example that they've used fairly often, when they teach, is that we're always ordering off of the menu of what we think we can have. Now, clairaudience wasn't on my menu when it showed up. I really didn't exist. I didn't think in those terms. It was an odd thing, and I had to understand it through the experience with it in an ongoing way. But it exists and it can be had. And there people come to the workshop sometimes and they're opening up psychically after the fact, and perhaps only because they're with somebody who says, this is possible, and suddenly it becomes possible. It's always been possible, but it's been unclaimed. So imagine, you're going to the Thai restaurant, and all of a sudden you want the pasta.
Right.
You want the meatballs. You assume you can't have it, but you don't know. I mean, there may be a whole other menu that's available to you and to all of us of potential that we haven't begun to claim.
And how do we access that whole other menu?
Well, my sense is that it's not aligned through the personality structure, which knows itself through the inherited structure that we all know. So, I mean, if you look around you, all of the institutions that we have, for the most part, we've inherited them.
Yes.
This is what a bank is. This is what a government is. And we think that these are the only ways that we can know perhaps the ideas behind them. So we expect that there will always be a bank,
right,
or always be a government. The guide said, you've been on a planet that's been at war for so very long, you can't imagine a planet without it. And consequently, you're going to keep claiming war because, in fact, you expect it. The way this changes is to align to a level of consciousness where war is not an option, where it doesn't exist. Now, my personality self can't do that, but the divine self, or the true self that they say is the truth of who you are, can, because the true self knows itself beyond those structures, and also outside of the limitations that we've bought into. I mean, that's so much of the Book of Freedom, is that the divine self is free, and as we identify with that, we begin to claim in that accord.
Right. So if we can align to the true self, put ourselves in that vibration, is that when other opportunities can open up and other possibilities can open up for us?
Yes.
Nice.
Absolutely, because you're not limiting yourself to what you've had.
Right. So really doing the attunements and coming into that right vibration will be the way to potentially let us see beyond the knowing.
Yeah, I mean, I travel. When I travel with this assistant, this guy Dustin. He's a nice guy, and he really wasn't into this work when he started working with me. But I needed somebody to help set up the events and to drive the car and do these things. And we were at a workshop once, and I was watching him do partner work with somebody else because we needed an extra person to work, and I saw him stumble as he was standing, and I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, the floor just disappeared." And what happened was the energy in the room just turned into something completely different, and he began to have these experiences, and now he's comfortable with them.
Right.
And there's much more to be had, I think, than just sort of phenomena. Psychic phenomena is interesting, and it's fascinating to have the experiences with energy. But I think the potential here is that we can know who we are and know who others are beyond the prescriptions that we've inherited, and the judgment that we bring to them, which that is in and of itself can change everything.
Now, there's another page in the book that talks about how we actually can't be fully realized until we are all fully realized. And you talked about this before, about this idea of the 100th monkey, where there has to be some sort of tipping point where potentially we all at some point reach this higher octave. Let's say, for example, we did get to that tipping point. What would the world look like if we were all in that higher octave?
I don't know that they've talked about a tipping point in their work. Maybe if you have a quote.
I don't have the exact page of that. I just wrote it on my notes. But basically, it was something along the lines of, like, if we all can't be fully realized until everybody's fully realized.
I don't recall, truthfully, and I'm not denying that they could have said something like that. It doesn't quite sound like them.
Okay.
one of the things that I've understood, because sometimes people are looking for an event, like, is there going to be a 100th monkey thing, and is
Right.
everybody going to just wake up, and what does that look like? And I get that's really not how it happens, because there is choice, and also what seems to be happening is you have to be able to acclimate to this stuff. So to be thrown into a room where the light is too bright too quickly is going to blind you. And you're not going to want to go back into that room. So this process of sort of adjusting to the higher octave or tone or frequency seems to be present. What they describe this as sometimes is, those sort of like false drop ceilings, those ugly drop
Yep.
ceilings, you see them sometimes in office buildings. And they said what this is kind of like is, people individually are punching a hole in that ceiling to begin to experience what exists beyond it. And the more people that do that, then the ceiling just falls away.
Right.
It's no longer an obstacle. You get to see what's always been beyond it.
Right.
But I think the idea is what's always been beyond it. You're not, the guides say again and again, you can't make anything holy. You can realize the inherent divinity. And it's through the realization of the inherent divinity that everything has changed.
Right.
And again, this is sort of stuff that can be experienced physically.
Right.
It's interesting. They talk about this in the book you're speaking to, the Book of Freedom, as the echo, which is the vibrational feedback that you can get when you claim the divine in form in something before you.
Excellent. Now, there's a few questions I had that are a little more on the fun side that maybe the guides could answer, a little more creative. And I was wondering, because they have tuned in already for this podcast, and the first big question I had for the guides would be, what is the purpose of existence?
It's like, that's a fun question. So
Yeah.
I don't know what they're going to say. We don't have that much time left. I'll go in here. I never said this to your audience. When I hear, I whisper the words and repeat them, and that's why I do this funny mumble thing. It's just
Right.
the way it comes through.
Yeah.
So what is the purpose for existence? I'll see if they want to take this one. We would love to. They're saying we would love to realize, to realize and know who you are, to claim the identity, and to claim the identity of the true self, that is the gift of being, that is the gift of being. It is not a penance. It is not a penance to be realized. To be realized does not mean, it does not mean that your life stops as it is, that your life stops as it is. It means you encounter the world. It means you encounter the world in a much different way, and you realize who you are, and you realize who you are in love, in all your encounters, And the denial of the divine, which is the issue here, is only remedied through the choice, through the choice to realize an underlying choice. You choose to realize. You choose to realize by agreeing to the new, and in other words, being willing to release the old, the mask you have worn, or how you identify meaning, or how you have identified meaning. The true self as you, is who is realized, is who is realized. He comes forth in an awakened state, for the benefit of all, period, in the same period.
All right. Thank you for that. One of the bigger, let's say, spiritual awakenings that I've ever had in my life, and before this actually happened, I would consider myself an atheist like yourself, but it was actually during an ayahuasca ceremony, the same place that I was with Aubrey in July, and it was that with ayahuasca in plant medicines, they actually say that there is a spirit behind the plant. It's not just equivalent to taking a drug. There actually is a spirit. And I was wondering if the guides could comment on the nature of the spirit of ayahuasca, and if there's any sort of relation to your guides and that spirit.
They've never really spoken about this. I don't know if they will. We would like to. Again, I'm hearing we would like to. The spirit of the plant. The spirit of the plant is nature in accordance with the divine self, with the divine self, the plant itself. So the plant itself operates multidimensionally, and as ingested, the opportunity for realization is increased. The mandate of the plant is in fact awakening, but the individual individual must acquiesce to a level of agreement in order to do this. If they just mind simply ingesting the plant and having the experience not promise awakening, does not promise awakening. It does promise a new way of seeing, that may be contrary to what's been understood, or believed in prior, That is always high, but that is not always high. To reach a high state of understanding through medicine, while possible is more challenging than undergoing a process over lifetimes of realization. The medicine may provoke you to memory of who you truly are, but the opportunity must then be there. To realize it in the daily life. It's productive, but not the only way forward. Period. And they're saying period.
That's excellent. Yeah, that's been my exact experience with it. Is that it does open the door for you, but it's not going to do the work for you, like you've iterated in your work as well. And they mentioned it's not the only way forward. And I was curious if they had any other tools of, let's say, transformation that they could recommend as practices for people to take on that can help move them to a higher octave.
I hear see the divine in everybody, and you'll know who you are immediately. But you have to be willing to do that. Go outside and realize that the divine must be in all things, in each one you pass, regardless of what you see, of what you see, or how you would see them, through the data of history. You will awaken very quickly. When you stop precluding people, and yourself from your true nature. Period.
Right, thank you for that. I think as a last question to finish off here,
Sure.
If you had one wish for humanity, one thing that you wish that you could just wave a magic wand and change any aspect of it that you'd like, what would that be and why?
I would suggest that it would be that we stop acting in fear, so that we could know ourselves as free of it. It's very hard to love somebody when you're frightened of them. Very hard to love yourself when you're frightened of yourself, or those parts of you that may be challenging to love. And that's all fear. And then the question is, what would happen if we weren't so afraid? What would we be capable of if we weren't so terrified of each other? Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Well, Paul, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview today. It's been amazing. Your workshop is going to be on February 23rd and 24th in Vancouver. And, of course, I will link all of that in the show notes to this. And the event will be called Beyond the Knowing. What can people expect on the day or the weekend of the workshop?
Well, the guides come through and teach, so they're lecturing, but they're also working to attune everybody who's there to get them working with the energy. So it's very experiential. The energy is usually pretty high. People open up in ways that they don't know that they can, very often. And they take questions on the teachings and also on people's personal lives. But they'll usually lecture. I don't plan these things, so I just am telling you what often happens. I don't know what the subject will be. They'll usually teach to the title of the workshop, but sometimes they just have a whole other agenda and they go for it. So I hope you can come. You might find it interesting.
I'm definitely looking forward to it. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in Vancouver on February 23rd and 24th. We will see you then. Thank you.